All right. Well, I'm pleased to have with me Reverend Ed Brown. We're going to talk today about creation care and his work as director and CEO of Care of Creation, and how he also serves as catalyst for creation care for the Lausanne movement. And with that brief introduction, Ed, I'll invite you to expand on that and tell us a little bit more about yourself and about the work of Care of Creation.
Sure. Well, very happy to meet all of you online or electronically or whatever. I'm talking to you from Madison, Wisconsin, and as Dr. Bowen said, I'm the director of Care of Creation. We founded this organization in 2005, so about 13 years ago, with the goal of mobilizing the church around the world to care for God's creation, or mobilizing the church to respond to the environmental crisis. We use different phrases depending on who we're talking to. Important to note that I am not an environmental scientist. I'm an ordained Baptist pastor, and I came to this work. I've been in this area about 20 years, almost 20 years, but I came to it from my first half of my career was very much traditional ministry. Pastor of a church. Before that, missionary kid, grew up in Pakistan. First thing I ever wrote about a Christian view of the environment, I called myself, it was Confessions of a Reluctant Environmentalist. Because in some ways, I felt like God was dragging me here, not quite kicking and screaming, but certainly somewhat reluctantly. He clearly had led us to work with an environmental organization called Ensemble Institute in Michigan. And this was something we felt we were supposed to be doing, my wife and I, but at the same time we were dealing with two missionary families who didn't quite understand how hugging trees could fit with the Great Commission. So this is what actually led to the thought process through which I wrote my first book, Our Father's World, Mobilizing the Church to Care for God's Creation, which is temporarily out of print. New edition is coming out in about a month. So it should be available on Amazon. Our Father's World, Mobilizing the Church to Care for God's Creation. So
that's that's an interesting connection. Let me just jump in for a second. And so with Ensemble Institute, you started working with them because you saw a connection between the work they were doing and Great Commission. Can you say a little more about that?
Well, actually, not quite. I was hired by Ensemble because they needed a manager. They needed someone who could administer, who could administrate, and they really needed help with administration. So Cal DeWitt, who many would consider the founder of the modern evangelical environmental movement, brought me on, even though I knew very little about the environment, but I could manage a nonprofit organization, and that's what they really needed. So I spent 5 years with them, 5 years with Cal DeWitt, having breakfast with him almost every week. You have to learn something. And the difference is Ensemble is a natural sciences organization, so it's all biologists, ecologists, and so on. Although they're teaching and they're researching from the point of view, everything within a Christian context. But I spent 5 years looking at the problems they were dealing with from a theological point of view, as a missionary, as a pastor. And I really came to the end of my time at Ensemble with a couple of conclusions. One was that the scientists had done their jobs. They had diagnosed the problem for us. Problems. And you can say the problem of God's creation, and within that subset, things like climate change, pollution, water, and so on. Scientists had done their problems, but the scientists couldn't solve the problem. That was going to be up to the rest of society. Political leaders, business leaders, teachers, and especially pastors, because I came at this as a pastor, firmly believing that biblically, environmental problems are sin problems. Well, all of our problems are sin problems, but especially environmental problems. Even secular leaders will tell us that what they see driving climate change and plastics in the ocean and everything else is greed, ambition, materialism. And if we see those in the context of sin, there's only one answer to sin, and that's Jesus. And the only way the world gets Jesus is through the church. So my conclusion from the time with all those scientists was, you guys have done your work, but if the church doesn't start to listen, we're at a dead end, because the church is the only one that can solve this problem. I wrote a whole book about this, so I have to be careful not to give you the whole sermon all at once.
No, that's a great introduction. So there's a certain amount of serendipity in how you came to this. Well, we might say that is God's leading, but kind of putting you in the place to encounter Calduit and become involved in this work. It wasn't your original career plan, apparently.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And in fact, as I look back at where I was when we founded Care of Creation, I came into the creation care movement at that point with really a very unique background. I had spent 5 years with Cal, and because of that, I knew many, many scientists, Christians who are scientists in Christian colleges all over the country, because that's Sable's constituency. I knew people in missions because of my background in missions. I knew pastors because of my background as a pastor. And interestingly, I wouldn't have thought of this ahead of time, but because I spent 5 years at InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, I knew people all over the world through InterVarsity's connections with the IFES, International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, which led me to the Lausanne movement that we'll get back to in a minute or two. Lausanne movement being a network of Christian leaders all over the world, and the Lausanne movement led me to the World Evangelical Alliance, which I think you have connections to. So in some ways, I found myself at the start of Care of Creation with a multitude of background of relationships that no one else in the movement had. And God's allowed me really to pull all this together. My wife sometimes looks at our mailing list and says, who are these people? Because it's easy to get on my mailing list. It's really hard to get off, because I try to keep track of people from all the different stages of where we've been.
Yeah. And so then as your work developed, you created Care of Creation. That, I assume, is a nonprofit organization that you run. And tell me, how does Care of Creation work?
Care of Creation we founded it initially to be an umbrella for a single project in Africa, in Kenya. That was where there was a younger missionary there with his family trying to do something he called environmental missions. The concept is very much like medical missions. Just take out the word medical and put in the word environmental. Medical missions, you try to share the love of Jesus by healing people's bodies as well as ministering to their souls. In environmental missions, we want to heal people's land, but also minister to their souls through discipleship and that sort of thing. So Craig was trying to do environmental missions. He was in Kenya. He'd grown up there, a missionary kid like me. I grew up in Pakistan. And at my time with Sable was ending, and Craig writes to me, he says, we want to do this environmental mission stuff. We can't find any organization working in Kenya that understands what we want to do. So our home church has said, maybe we need to create a whole new mission organization. Why don't you help us? And I'm thinking, okay, Craig, you want to put evangelical, environmental, and missions all in one package. As far as we know, no one's ever done this before. There isn't any money. My wife can't work because of medical reasons. Not sure this is going to happen, but in God's wisdom, it did happen. That was the spring of 2005, and we haven't looked back. We grew from just supporting Craig and now a second project in Tanzania to, with the mission statement, mobilizing the church, realizing that while in East Africa, mobilizing the church might mean working with Christian farmers. In the US, it might mean working with churches in suburbia, with seminars to help people to understand what's happening in God's creation and what their faith has to say about it, and so on. And this eventually led to a partnership with Lausanne, with WEA, with Russia International, which is an organization with chapters in about 20 countries, and so on. So.
Now, I think most people have an idea what medical missions look like. I mean, you have medical professionals going in, providing medical care, maybe surgery, that type of thing. What does an environmental mission look like? What would you actually do on the ground?
Well, in the case of our project in Kijabi, Kenya, it has 2 or 3 different dimensions to it. An important one is agriculture. 80% of Kenyans are Christians, 80% of Kenyans are farmers. Almost everyone farms. A lot of those farms would be like our backyard vegetable garden, but many of them, many people in Kenya make their primary living from farming. None of them have ever heard a sermon about farming. And many of them are suffering with exhausted soil, with an exploding population that's trying to grow more food from less land, and so on. So there's a tremendous opportunity here to provide biblical principles to help farmers to both understand their faith better and to understand their land better, and in the end to grow a lot more food with the same or even a little bit less effort. Program's called Farming God's Way. We didn't invent it. It was actually invented down in Zimbabwe. But Craig Sorley has developed one of the best training centers for Farming God's Way at our project site in Kenya. So you could call it a farming program that uses biblical principles. You could call it a discipleship program that happens to use farming. It works both directions. But the result is people who actually apply this can get 3, 4, 5 times as much food from the same amount of land. And it's made a tremendous difference in a lot of people's lives. So then we get involved in fighting deforestation with tree planting and some other things too.
Would it be fair to say then that one aspect of this work is more sustainable agriculture? You're kind of teaching people sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, if I were talking to people who didn't have a Christian background, I'd say we're teaching conservation, no-till agriculture. But we're teaching it in a culturally appropriate way with using the kind of language Kenyans will understand. They're Christians, they love faith language. So you talk to them about God is the first farmer, God owns your land, it's God's field, it's not your field. You need to take care of it because you're going to answer to Him for it. And this culturally appropriate language has really bolstered the very good and very up-to-date technical things we teach them about putting compost on the land and that sort of thing. So it's a wonderful blend of really up-to-date science and really solid biblical teaching. Kind of wish I'd invented it myself, but we're using it.
Well, it sounds like you're using it very well. And so in that sense, biblically, you're approaching it in terms of being good stewards of creation. Yeah. And being a good steward includes using proper practices and thinking sustainably.
Absolutely, and I'd say this really goes to the heart of what we're doing. I don't remember saying it exactly like this before, but we believe there's a unity between God's world and God's word. Yeah, in fact, the Bible tells us that He reveals Himself to us both ways, through the written word, but also through the created world. And so in some ways, the theologian and the scientist are speaking the same language, or they ought to be. And, you know, a footnote here, if any of you guys in this class are scientists or considering a field in a career in science, go for it. Because I think that's really, really important that we have solid biblical Christians who are working in the area of science, especially the biological and environmental sciences. We need you guys. But here we got the harmony between appropriate agricultural techniques and appropriate discipleship teaching. They reinforce each other, and the result is wonderful food.
So would it be fair to say something like this, that as Scripture says to us, as you do unto the least of these, you do unto me also? You've kind of extended that to all of creation?
Oh, absolutely, yes. In fact, you know, there are some frightening reports coming out now about the loss of biodiversity, about the number of God's creatures that are vanishing from the earth right now because of human activity. And what you're reading from these secular reports is, oh, this is terrible for the future of humanity. And it is. We lose the pollinating insects. There goes our food supply. So this is true. We hurt ourselves, but even more, we are disobeying God's first command to us, which is to care for his creatures. And that reflects not only on our own future health as human beings in a human society, but what we're going to say to God, who told us to take care of these creatures.
Now, I want to understand more about the work that you do. Before we go there, I want to finish with the organization part of it. So you mentioned connected to Lausanne. What do you do as part of the Lausanne movement?
The Lausanne movement, for those who may not be familiar, was founded in 1974 in Lausanne, Switzerland, which is where it gets its name, by Billy Graham and John Stott, who felt the need to bring Christians from countries all over the world together just to talk to each other. There was another meeting in 1989, 15 years later in Manila, and then the most recent one was in Cape Town in 2010. 4,000 Christian leaders attended. I was fortunate to be one of those. And out of that, the Cape Town meetings came a document called the Cape Town Commitment, which addressed a number of different issues that the Lausanne leaders felt the church needs to be addressing in this modern age. One of those was creation care. And so from that section of the Cape Town Commitment came a desire on the part of Lausanne leadership to investigate creation care and the gospel a little more thoroughly. They asked me to convene a consultation in Jamaica in 2012 on the question of creation care and the gospel, which we did. We met in November of 2012, actually the same week that Superstorm Sandy was coming ashore in New York City and New Jersey and causing great devastation. Out of the Jamaica consultation came a couple of things. The Jamaica Call to Action, which I'll give you a link to. It's a very important document for your students to take a look at. A book called Creation Care and the Gospel, which was a multiple author from the different speakers at Jamaica. I wrote the introduction in the first chapter. Some folks in England actually did the editing. But the third thing, and most important, I think, was a global campaign for creation care and the gospel. The conviction that the entire church around the world needs to understand that creation care and the gospel are linked, and that our task as Christians includes caring for God's world. So the global campaign actually became launched in 2014, Southeast Asia. The idea was to do regional conferences, each one hitting 9 or 10 countries. And since 2014, we've actually done this 10 times. So we've reached into 130 countries in 5 years. And we now have what we would consider a genuine global creation care movement. We call it the Lausanne WEA Creation Care Network. WEA joined this in about 2016, I think. So we added a W to it. And we have 2 more conferences planned in 2019 and early 2020, at which point we will have done 12 conferences and probably will have touched about 150 countries. So exciting stuff. And a lot of my work now, working with other leaders, is keeping track of people we have met, we've discovered in these different countries, encouraging them in having conferences within their own nations, and in getting out people to attend the big international conferences like the UN climate conferences and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, very good. That sounds exciting. So I'm hearing a second level of the work. If the first level is the on-the-ground project, sustainable agriculture, really educating people about creation care, it sounds like your regional conferences are at another level, focusing on leaders, perhaps?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, and what is it that you expect or hope that those leaders will do after they've been educated?
Well, you can tell that I'm not at the beginning of my career, David. I only have a limited number of years left. And I've had people say, so what's your goal in all this? I've given some thought to that, as I suppose we all should, probably before we get to my age. My goal is not to solve the environmental crisis. I don't think anyone can do that. I'm not sure even that it's possible. It would be nice if God would step in. My goal is a little bit more humble. What I want to do, and I think I've got other leaders working with me who would agree with this, what we want to do is to change the conversation so that caring for God's creation becomes a normal part of what we believe it is to be a Bible-believing Christian. Just like most of us would tend to agree that if you're a Christian, you love your wife and you're faithful to her. If you're a Christian, you love your children. If you're a Christian, you keep your body whole and healthy because that honors and glorifies God. If you're a Christian, you care for God's creation. Now, partly because of my own pastoral background, I have a very I have a strong confidence in the church. And I don't spend a lot of time trying to say to people in Manila or in Kenya or in Pakistan, this is what you should be doing. I'm just saying this is what the Bible says. We are all called to care for God's creation. Pakistan is your part of God's creation. What are you doing about it? And let them figure it out. And we've seen a lot of spontaneous stuff develop. In Manila a number of years ago, the Christian publisher there, some of their staff people went to one of our seminars, came back and said to their boss, we need to do a Sunday school curriculum on creation care. So they produced an entire curriculum from grades K through adult on creation care. They used a whole bunch of the book from material from one of my books without ever letting me know, naturally. And at one point I got an email from a friend saying, have you seen the curriculum in the Philippines? It's got your fingerprints all over it. Well, I hadn't seen it. I hadn't even heard of it. But that's an example of people hearing the message, we as Christians need to care for God's creation. And then jumping into their own area and saying, this is what we need to do. And so they did it. And last I heard, it was being translated in Hong Kong into Chinese for use in the Chinese world as well. I don't know if they ever finished that part of it or not.
Yeah. So we could say you do have a theory of change or a model of change. And that is really to look at the church as the agent of change in the community. So you've got to get the church engaged. And then as they go about their work in ministering to others, creation becomes part of the natural work of the church.
Yeah, if I were an academic or a sociologist, I'd probably talk about my theory of change. I'd just go out and do it. So, no, you're right. I believe that, theologically, that the church is at the heart of God's plan. And so if we want to change things, we've got to work through the church. But practically speaking, and I've a couple of times I've had an opportunity to address like secular audiences. And one of my approaches there is to say, if you want to change attitudes about the environment around the world, you need to find an organization or an institution that exists in every country, that reaches every level of society from the richest to the poorest, that has a set of values that are compatible with environmental concern. We have that. It's the church. The church exists in every country. The church exists in every level of society. The church has values. We call it theology, that actually is compatible with caring for the world. God created the world. God told us what went wrong, sin. God told us we're responsible for fixing it. So, sorry, I've launched into another sermon.
No, you're doing great. You're doing great. So there's two areas that you're raising there that I'm interested in. One is, what are the opportunities, but also the challenges of engaging the church in creation care? And then the other is, do you see some of the big secular organizations, I'm thinking the United Nations and so on, do you see them becoming more willing to collaborate with or partner with the faith community?
To answer the first one first, the opportunity is obviously clear. And I've talked to other people like me who are going around and speaking in different churches. I think we all share the experience that it's almost impossible to go to any church anywhere and not find someone that it appears God has already spoken to about this. Because God has laid a burden on their heart. And one of the ways I think about it, I imagine this may be a little bit like things were during the days of the Reformation with John Calvin, Martin Luther, Zwingli, and so on. We know those big names. But one of the reasons I think they were able to see so much happen in such a relatively short period of time was because God was speaking at the grassroots level. There were people who were ready for this message. In the same way, all around the world, we see people waking up, and some of them come to us and they say, where have you been? Yeah, I felt so alone. I'm the only one I feel like I'm the only one in my church. My pastor doesn't understand. My friends don't seem to understand, but I just can't get away from this. I feel like God's calling us to this. So that's the opportunity. I think the Spirit is waking things up. And if we've seen a global movement happen in just 5 years and 130 nations, it's not because of any particularly unique strategy or anything special we've done. I think we've just caught the wave, and we've given people an opportunity to come together and to discover each other. And so I'm excited that that's happened. The challenge is that there's some really, really bad theology out there that is hindering what we're trying to do. There are people who still see the gospel as essentially John 3:16. You must be born again, and then you're going to go to heaven, so it doesn't matter what happens now. There's bad eschatology where people say, oh, it's all going to burn up anyway, so it doesn't matter. It's the dorm room mentality. I'm going to leave this dorm room at the end of the semester, so who cares what the walls look like? That's how some of us are tending to treat creation. And I think it's unbiblical. I think it's sinful, but we still have people who persist in that a little bit. And that's where our challenge is. In the US in particular, but in some other countries, we got another challenge, and that's political. The whole question of environment has been contaminated by politics. And this has happened because of both sides. On the conservative side, we have people telling us that to be a Christian, you have to be Republican, and to be Republican, you have to be anti-environment. On the progressive side, we have people telling us, if you want to be environmental, you've also got to buy a package that includes pro-abortion and gay rights and so on. People like me are trying to draw a wedge in there and say, no, 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 no. It's that's politics trying to dictate our theology, and our theology should be dictating our politics. So, yeah. Yeah,
very good. It seems like those challenges may have been true in the U.S. As you know, the U.S. pulled out of the Paris Accords. There's almost been kind of an anti-science feel in the U.S. over the last decade. And I would see this is also challenging some of your work.
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, I got a number of sympathy emails after the last presidential election. How are you holding up, Ed? What's going to happen now? And I try not to be too overtly political in my Facebook posts and so on. But the direction the current administration is going is of great concern, partly because they're undoing things that took many, many years to put into place. And it may take an equal number of years to swing things back. So, and in some cases like climate change, we may well, according to the latest reports, be getting to a point where if we don't act soon, it will actually be too late. And we will have started unstoppable processes in the atmosphere and so on, where we can do nothing but watch disasters unfold.
Yeah. So given the challenges and some reports suggest that we have in fact turned that corner and we turned the wrong way. In that environment, do you see things that give you hope?
Do I see things that give me hope?
Right.
On a human level, not much. I was just reviewing one of the latest reports, which is the IPCC report that came out on the 8th of October, commenting on global warming, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C. I will send you a link so you can have people look up that report if you like. One of the things they say is limiting global warming to 1.5 would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, transport, and cities. That limiting warming to that degree is possible within the laws of chemistry and physics, but doing so would require unprecedented changes. In other words, we have not crossed the theoretical boundary yet. If we were to get all our political ducks in a row and all our economic and business ducks in a row, we could still put the brakes on it. Although it has to be said in that context that 1.5 degrees of warming is still another half a degree further than we have right now. And that means a lot more hurricanes, a lot more sea level rise, no matter what we do. So on a human level, there's not a whole lot of hope. Unless you're a lot more optimistic about politics and business and society than I am. On the other hand, we're not dealing purely with that. We're also dealing with a sovereign God, a God who made this world, a God who loves this world as much as we do. And he told us to be faithful. I sometimes come back to what God said to the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6. Go and preach your message until the cities are empty, until the land is desolate, until no one is left alive in the land, and then redemption will come. That's a very, very loose paraphrase, but God wasn't calling Isaiah to success. He was calling Isaiah to be faithful. And I think that's what we're called to do, is to call the church to be faithful. And that perhaps God will step in before things get completely out of control. Or perhaps Jesus comes and then sets up his kingdom, and then we'll see how things should have been done in the first place.
Well, I'm also thinking in terms of the aim you described, which is to change the conversation. And I wonder if you also see reason for hope, like you're having an impact on that level.
In that sense, yes. I think we see more and more people who are responding with, yes, this is something we should do. We see people at the congregational level starting to say we need to teach this to our kids. I think it's a little bit slow turning the church around, but I'm quite hopeful that the message is being heard and being responded to. Lots and lots of denominations have put out statements about creation care and that sort of thing. Lots of books being written. So yes, there is hope that the church will hear and respond.
When you talk about changing the conversation, one of the things we've been discussing in this class is the concept of common ground. That common space that everybody shares in equally. Do you see that as relevant to your work of climate change? Do we need to build up that concept of common ground?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Can I assume that you have touched on the tragedy of the commons in discussing this?
To a degree, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Tragedy of the commons is an example from an earlier day when you had a village that had a common pasture in the center of the community, and everyone can share that. But the tragedy of the commons is that the cost of limiting that we tend to overuse any commons because an economist could describe this better than me. The personal cost to me of not using my full share is greater than the benefit to me, or the perceived benefit. And so whether it's a pasture, whether it's a fishery, whether it's the amount of CO2 that the atmosphere can absorb, we all tend to see our short-term benefit and not the long-term benefit to society, and we act accordingly. This is perhaps climate change is one of the best, is probably not the best adjective to use, but one of the clearest examples of what happens when we abuse a common good. And the problem is that this process has worked out over centuries and will work out over even more centuries. But it's clear that much of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere now and that is causing the problems that we see now was produced by the US, by Europe, by the developed world. And yet the costs are being borne by the developing world. They have not had a chance to burn their share of CO2 yet. If they do burn as much CO2 as perhaps they're entitled to because of the pattern set by us, then the result is disaster for everyone. So the atmosphere is a common good that ought to be shared. The atmosphere has a limited ability to absorb CO2 without causing serious and perhaps unstoppable damage to society. Yeah, we could go on for hours about this, but it's a good example of what happens when we don't observe, when we don't act biblically toward each other in sharing a common good with all of society. Yeah, I didn't express that very well, but.
Well, then, and so you tied it back to a biblical approach to that common ground, that we have a shared responsibility and the call to think about how we're impacting not only other parts of the world, but perhaps also future generations.
Oh, yes, very much so. And in fact, I just came last week from a meeting of the Accord Network, which is the Association of Christian Relief and Development Organizations. And one of the things, these are all organizations whose reason for existence is to fight poverty and to fight hunger. Not many of them would consider themselves environmental organizations by any stretch of the imagination. And many try to avoid terms like climate change because of their constituency, the people that give them money. Our message to these guys is, you guys can't fight poverty. You can't succeed in fighting hunger if you don't deal with these environmental issues, including climate change, because it's all tied together. Some of them are listening.
Yeah, and so in that sense, the climate issues are really basic to so many other issues in the world where there's inequity, hunger, and so on. It's really basic to all those issues.
Oh, yeah. In fact, a good example of that is the crisis now unfolding in Syria. There's we'll never know for sure, but there seems to be some good evidence that the problems in Syria originated with a multi-year drought that was very likely either caused by or exacerbated by climate change. The drought caused agriculture across the country to collapse. People moved into the cities because that was the only place to find food. At this point, you have political incompetence added to ethnic tension, all of which was built on top of this environmental problem of drought. And the result has been a horrendous civil war. And we can see this scenario unfolding all over the world in coming decades in places like Bangladesh, where it won't be long before a good portion of Bangladesh is actually underwater because of rising sea levels. It's only a few feet above sea level now. To areas of South America with massive deforestation going on and so on.
Yeah. So given the way things are unfolding, I mean, you're speaking in this case of public students. What charge or challenge would you like to offer to them? What do you think they should thinking about as they look ahead to their own careers?
Okay. What I'd like to say to students, young people of any sort, assuming that I'm talking to you guys that you're Christians, is that I would encourage you to understand your faith, your belief in the gospel, as a fully dimensioned faith that includes God's creation. That you can read my book to see the full exposition about it, but we're talking relationship with God, relationship with myself, relationship with other people, and relationship with creation. That the gospel must include that relationship with creation. Colossians 1:15-20 is the most solid biblical foundation for that. God in Christ was reconciling all things to himself, and the all things are not just people, but all things in creation. This is the gospel. I encourage you guys to go out into the world now, and especially after you graduate, thinking about your faith as applying to all of life and all of society, including the creation, care, and environmental aspects of it. Then I would encourage you to look for a career that, first of all, God's leading you to, and obviously one that uses your skills, abilities, talents, and desires. But thirdly, that gives you an opportunity to engage with the world on this level. We desperately need Christians who are willing to put themselves on the front lines of creation care, whether that be as a teacher, teaching kids how important it is to care for the plants and animals around us, whether it's actually as an environmental scientist, whether it's as a political leader, whether it's even as someone in a huge corporation who can influence that corporation in terms of what they do. Being in Boise, I don't know if there are any of you guys who are going into farming, but go for it, but do your farming in ways that are friendly to God's creation. And in almost every field, I think you're going to find that if you can develop environmental skills and environmental backgrounds, you will find yourself more valuable in the job market than otherwise, because every company is going to be looking for experts in the field of science, whether it's the field of environmental issues, including environmental science, whether it's business or engineering or the natural sciences or teaching or whatever.
Just say a little bit more about that. When you say environmental skills, really what you're suggesting is can integrate with many different professions. What would be some examples of environmental skills?
Okay, well, the favorite word for a lot of people is sustainability. Now, let me use an illustration I sometimes use in my talks. We encourage people, obviously, to make lifestyle changes. These are important. I think you should use as little electricity as you can around your house. You should drive as efficiently as you can and drive as little as you can. If a bicycle will work, instead of a car, use the bicycle and so on. But in whatever job you have, you probably have an opportunity to have a greater environmental impact than you do at home. So let's take the example of electricity. I can take my house entirely off the grid. I can put solar panels up and so on, and I can bring my use of electricity down to zero. But if I happen to be the facilities manager at the shopping mall a mile away from my house, and I can get that shopping mall to reduce its energy consumption by just 10%. Number one, I've created tremendous value for my boss or my company. Number two, I've probably saved hundreds of times more electricity than I would have saved in my house. So that's just one example, but that could be applied almost anywhere, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a business administrator figuring out how to do things more efficiently, whether you're a theologian, whether you're a politician working on policies. All of these things are areas where you can have a tremendous influence and where God expects us to have an influence.
Yeah, that's good. So a word from my field might be to become more mindful of how we impact the environment and how that can apply in our personal lives, also our business and professional lives, and so on. In fact, it seems like that fits nicely with your aim in terms of changing the conversation, that impact on the environment, not only within the church, but generally in our professional work, conversation. It should be integrated into that conversation as well.
Absolutely. And so I'd say the fact that you're a psychologist, but you're covering topics like this in your class is you're my exhibit A right now of what a Christian academic should be doing. And then that's finding ways to bring this topic into the into the regular curriculum so that people are thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
so
great.
You get an A, David.
All right. Thank you. I'll hold on. So, well, just as some closing thoughts, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you would like to bring up to our listeners?
Well, I think we've covered a great deal. You know, there's obviously more in my book and in other books that would help people to get into, like, you know, you think about church life, there are lots of different dimensions of what you do in a church, from your facilities and energy use there, to what you're doing with the land, to how you're teaching and so on. But I think I've probably given you guys enough to chew about.
Well, I think you have. It's been very good. I really appreciate the way you think about the church as change and bringing that into the conversation. I think those are very accessible concepts that most people should be able to take.
Right. Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ed.